I'm Jan Visser, and I am meeting with Jim Lees in Franschhoek, the Western Cape, South Africa. I'm the chief editor of a book on seeking understanding, and Jim, you wrote a chapter for that book on HIV, medical science, and the call for greater humanness. So the purpose of the conversation that we're having is actually to allow the reader to get to know the author, and by doing so be better prepared to read a chapter. You wrote a profound chapter, quite different from many of the other chapters that appear in the book, and like I ask all the authors, how come? Where do you come from? Why this chapter? What kind of personal experiences are there that led you to this point in life where you write this particular chapter?
Thank you, Jan, and thank you for coming to Franschhoek to see me, and for this book. Actually, thank you for this book that you're putting together. I think it's actually very important, and it's very timely in terms of us as a species making it to the future. I think that if the whole HIV epidemic has taught me anything, it's that we can't do it alone. There's a nice sort of Buddhist koan that nobody can do it for you, and no one can do it alone. And I think that's where we sit right at the moment. And of course, our conversations have been about a deeper sense of humanness, and how my 30 years of work with the HIV epidemic has been a big part of my thinking about who I am as an individual and as a human being, and who we are as a species and as human beings. But it's not an easy thing that you've asked me to do, because in order to write this chapter, I've had to go back and examine memories and thoughts and emotions that I don't necessarily want to go back and examine and feel again. Living through the first decade and part of the second decade of the HIV epidemic was painful.
Talking about the 1980s.
I'm talking about the 1980s and the 1990s. And it was painful. And it was painful for many, many people. It was a time of fear. It was a time when we as a species responded in ways that brought out the best of who we can be. And that's part of what is called the San Francisco model of the response to HIV, where really it changed the ethos of the community, of the city, and brought about a new kind of care for each other, and broke down barriers, racial barriers, sexual identity barriers, economic barriers. And death, as it were, was the great unifier and brought people together, because it was a time before antiretroviral medications. But the epidemic also brought out the worst in who we can be. And we talk now about, the First Amendment rights in the United States, and people feeling that it's their right to speak their hate openly and publicly. But in fact, in the 80s and the early 90s, people were speaking their hate openly and publicly around HIV, in terms of shunning of people with HIV, the disregard of an entire gay community as being not worthy of medical research and medical attention and response by the Reagan administration. The stigma of a home that people set up on Long Island for children born with HIV, so just little infants, and that being burned down because the neighbors were afraid. So what you've asked me to do is remember, I think, a very painful time in our history, and my own personal history.
You were directly involved with those communities.
Absolutely, because I was at the time working with homeless and runaway teenagers in San Francisco who had HIV. So it's already marginalized, highly stigmatized young people who are living on the street and using drugs and prostituting to stay alive.
How would you describe the kind of work that you were doing?
The first thing that came to my mind was painful. Sorry. It was hard. We didn't know what we were doing because there were no models to go on. Nobody had thought about teenagers getting HIV by their own accord. Up until that point, it had been through blood transfusion, and at that point, most of the young people who had received HIV by blood transfusion were dead.
You mean infecting themselves deliberately?
Not deliberately, but through because these young homeless runaway teenagers, how they survived was by selling their bodies on the street, typically to men, and of course San Francisco was intravenous drug use, methamphetamine, the drug of choice. And so it was also by dirty needles. It was a time where we were learning from the young people themselves how to go forward. We had to build our own models, but in terms of methodologically, we built it by listening carefully to them, not telling them what to do, but by listening to them to learn what are the next steps we need to take in building the program. And I think that methodology has carried with me throughout my entire life. In work previous to the epidemic, and I think it's a deep part of who we are as human beings, is to whether it's responding to a medical crisis, whether it's development, it's about a true participatory approach, not a testing out a product and field testing a product, but engaging communities in conversations about their problems and how to find solutions. There's a fellow who I mention in the book called Anisur Rahman. And he believes that part of who we are as human beings is creative, and that creating the solutions to our problems is a deep part of expressing our humanness. But he fears that we live in not a period of creativist development, but consumerist development, where in fact the solutions to our problems are produced by, in this case, medical science, and we buy them back, versus how do we sit together as a community, discuss what our challenges are, and find our own solutions to those problems? In then working in India for 6 years after leaving San Francisco, and then being in Africa for the last 16 years, working in South Africa, a bit in Malawi, and a bit in Tanzania, I see this whole global approach to HIV as being one of medical science having created so-called solutions and taking them to scale according to evidence. But whose evidence? International organizations come in from typically Europe and America. They go to African communities, tell them what to do about HIV, and then they leave. And nothing changes.
Yeah, the book is about seeking understandings, and it is the understanding of what was actually happening or what is happening that's deficient.
How we define a problem is going to absolutely tell us how we're going to approach solving that problem. And my fear is, not my fear, my belief is that yes, there is an absolute medical biological component to HIV that requires good medical research and good medical response. But when it is defined only as a medical problem, then the solutions are going to be only medical. At this point in time where it almost feels like, actually it does feel like, and I have colleagues who feel this way as well and have stopped going to the international AIDS meetings, that we've given up on people and said, well, we have to just find tablets that are going to take care of things. And we've lost the effort put into understanding more deeply why we have an epidemic in the first place.
Right, yeah. So understanding just in terms of what the sciences have to offer. Traditionally, the sciences like biochemistry, that provides an insufficient picture of the reality.
Yeah. You see, I think I want to be very careful not to discount the good work of medical science. But what I want to say is that I get worried when there are profound problems, and medical science is put in charge of those problems and leads the way, and the bigger questions of our humanness, about who we are, don't get addressed. And I think HIV is a very good example of that. We express the worst and the best of who we can be as human beings within the epidemic. I've watched that for 30 years. And that challenges us to ask the very deeply reflective question, who are we and who do we want to be? So it's past, it's present, and future. Who do we want to become?
Yeah.
And then if we want to be, do we want to be people who are okay with passing on HIV knowingly, or by default because we were too afraid to get an HIV test ourselves? And I'm not doing this in a way that's saying blaming, but I'm saying there are complex issues related to this in terms of who we are as human beings, and will we address those issues of our own evolution as human beings, of our own deeper understandings of ourselves, and how it is that we are together. Because in fact, if you take the epidemic as a measure of how well we're doing watching each other's backs, we're not doing very well, certainly in South Africa. We're not doing very well at all. And it seems to me that medical science has said, well, people aren't doing a very good job watching each other's backs, so we better come in with some tablets to save the day. And of course, our companies will make a little money along the way as well.
Yeah. So in broadening the picture about what should be done, what is currently missing and that we could bring in, and how could it be brought in? You're writing about humanness. I'd like you to develop that concept a bit further.
In my last 30 years of working with young people, and in particular it showed up the most, it showed up in India first. The international organizations would be concerned about their food, clothing, and shelter. Mm-hmm. But the street children in India that I worked with, all over India, they would say, but food, clothing, and shelter, we can get those things. We're clever, we're creative, we work together, we work in teams, we watch out for each other. We can do those things. What we need help doing is untying the emotional knots inside of us that came from the wounds of being abused by our families, or actually having been sent to a big city by our families because they can't afford to keep us anymore. And that's painful stuff. Mm-hmm. And the response of the international organizations would be, and the organizations working with children would be, the on-the-ground organizations understood this, but the big organizations that were in charge of things globally would say, no, but that's luxury work. And until you take care of the food, clothing, and shelter, you can't do the luxury work. But in fact, if you take care of the emotional part, the other part takes care of itself. Mm-hmm. with the street kids. So I think if I move that into a bigger place, if you begin to provide platforms, and this is what I do in communities in South Africa, if you provide platforms where people can come together and begin to discuss what it is that they're struggling with, HIV in this case, which then opens up into the place of sexual violence as well. Mm-hmm. A, they begin to understand their context, understand what's happening, but B, they learn how to support each other, and C, they start to find solutions, typically in the ways they talk to their children, which is the future of the next generation. And I can tell you with no doubt that South African communities, after 20 years of global intervention for HIV, are hungry for actually those conversations. And the evidence for that, and I'll give you actually statistical population science evidence for this, is that I offer a course that we teach in communities called HIV and AIDS and Me, right? Mm-hmm. Now, I was invited to do this by a student who had attended that course at the university, who said, Doc, can you come and do this in my community because my community could really use this course? And I said, sure, I'll come. And I went and we did it for 7 weeks, once a week in the evening for 2 hours. And 40 people came, and it was a wonderful experience. And then they asked me back. I said, okay, I'll come again. And we did the same thing once a week, 2 hours a night for 7 weeks. And 90 people came. And then they said, will you come back again, Doc, because this was really great. And I did it again, and we did it in an adjacent community, and 110 people came. Then they asked me one more time, Doc, please, can you come back? because now even more people want to do it. I said, okay, here's the deal. I'm not doing any of the paperwork, the logistics, the setting up chairs, the keeping record of who's there. I'm just going to come in and teach, and I'll give the university certificates. We're not giving food, water, nothing. They just need to be there because they want to be there. And we're going to make it 9 weeks, 3 hours for each session. So once a week for 3 hours for 9 weeks. When I went, and they arranged a community hall. When I went and we opened the doors, there were, I kid you not, 500 people waiting to join that class. When we did it the next time, there were 600 people who showed up. And they are absolutely hungry for real conversations around HIV and what it means in their lives. Not directives to put on the condom, here's how you put on the condom, and don't have multiple partners, and those are great rules. But there are issues they need to deal with. What do I do when? How do I communicate to my child? How do I understand the pressures on my child when, for my teenage boy to be a man, he's got to have lots of girlfriends. And in fact, at a certain point, his friends challenge him because he hasn't made anybody pregnant yet. So you see, there are much deeper questions around the epidemic than covering up a penis. And
the most readers of the chapter will hopefully not have been infected and not have the disease either. I think the basic concept in your chapter is medicalization of human existence. Can one expand, can one extrapolate from that idea to other walks in life that are relevant to people, whether they have AIDS or not? Medicalization, of course, in all other respects, and we benefit from it, but there's also this tendency of interpreting our existence principally in medical terms, and this is part of the medical profession who goes astray in doing so, but it's also the so-called patients who may think of themselves in similar fashion.
I'm thinking for a moment if I want to do this, but you said that your intent here is for the potential readers to get to know the authors just a bit more, and I think that I have a very personal case in terms of medicalization, and how I kind of not rejected, but did something in addition to medicalization, and that was 2 years ago when I was diagnosed with prostate cancer, and the wonderful urologist who I found, who was really top class, world class, and a wonderful man, thinks in the medical format of proceeding, cutting, and then using medications to return one to where they were immediately thereafter. But for me, I had to hold him back, because you see, they want to get you on the table right away, and that's fine, and that's how they're trained, and that's what they see. They see a cancer and they want to remove it. For me, it prompted deeper questions about my own existence, how I was living my life, how I wanted to live my life, and so it prompted me to ask questions that weren't medical questions, but 2 years later I can say they were some of the most important questions I've asked about my life, and it prompted a deep self-reflective moment of 2 years that's changed my life for the better in remarkable ways. Now what's interesting in the parallel, so this is my tiny little AIDS epidemic that hit me. When you go online and start to search about this, because you know we men are terrified of prostate surgery. It's like, oh no, I won't be a man again. And in some senses I'm not a man again because I've been able to think about sexuality differently. And I'm so thankful for that. When you go online into the chat forums for men who have had prostate cancer, it's remarkable the number of men who say, I hope you never have to have this surgery, but you know what? It was the best thing for my relationship with my wife and I that has ever happened, because suddenly at the age of 59, 63, I've understood intimacy for the first time in my life because I've been blinded by sexuality this whole time. And this intimacy thing, wow, it's really great. I love this. I'm sorry that I missed this for so many years. So men who are thankful for what they were once terrified of before, in the same way that so many people with HIV I've met have said, you know, I don't wish this disease on anyone, but I'm a better person for having had it.
So, last question. In what spirit do you want your readers to read the chapter?
In what spirit do I want the readers to read the chapter? I actually hope that in fact, lots of people with HIV do read the chapter. I think it's important that they do, and I know that in my teaching in South Africa, in communities, I will give them the chapter to read, and I think it will be part of helping them understand their own experience in their own lives. The spirit that I want them to read it in, however, is one in which we're not afraid to challenge the things we believe in. Sometimes I think as human beings, as part of our humanness, we hold on to things to find our way, sort of signposts along the way, and we look for that next signpost to hold on to. But I think it's an era now where we need to let go of those signposts because we're holding on too tightly. We don't know the future. What we do know is that if we continue to the future in the way we've been traveling in the past, we're not going to make it as a species. I think the environmental crisis tells us clearly that we're not going to make it as a species. And so I want people to think, what are the deeper questions that we need to be asking about ourselves, not the simpler questions of how to fix our prostates, how to fix HIV, but the deeper questions of what is our journey as a species. We've made good decisions for, and I tell my students this, for 120,000 years. Gosh, we've made good decisions because we're here right now. So I want people to start thinking about what are the decisions we need to make so that 120,000 years from now, some form of our species can say, you know what, they went through this tough patch where they almost didn't make it, but because they started to ask those more important and deeper questions, we made it as a species. That's what I want our readers to do.
Let's hope that happens, Jim. I think there's a reason for humanity to survive, and it's a tough question in this particular epoch, where we are threatening our own existence through our own behavior. But that's indeed, I think, the spirit in which people should read your chapter, but also behave generally.
It's not just about our bodies surviving. No. It's about the deeper part of who we are as human beings surviving. It's that ability to connect, the empathy, the feeling, the joy of being in the company of those who you love. That's what is so threatened. And that's what we need to actually feed and nurture. And I believe if we nurture those things, then we can sort out some of the other things. So thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, Jim.
Okay.